The Bristol Blenheim approaching Duxford looks like an aircraft from the opening years of the Second World War. It has the short glazed nose of an early Blenheim, 2 radial engines, and the markings of No. 23 Squadron. But the surviving structure at the front of this aircraft did not spend the decades after the war inside a museum. For years, it traveled on British roads as part of a homemade electric car. The aircraft behind it has a different history. Most of its main structure was built in Canada in 1943, 4 years after the original Blenheim entered Royal Air Force service. The short nose came from Bristol Blenheim L6739. The wings, much of the fuselage, and the main airframe came from Canadian Fairchild Bolingbroke 10201. Together they formed G-BPIV, a flying reconstruction of Blenheim Mark 1F L6739. It is not the story of one complete aircraft preserved from wartime. It is the story of separate pieces that survived for different reasons, and of the accident that finally brought them together. L6739 was delivered to No. 23 Squadron on the 2nd of September 1939. 1 day later, Britain declared war on Germany. The Blenheim descended from a fast civilian aircraft, then entered Royal Air Force service as a light bomber. No. 23 Squadron operated aircraft adapted for night fighting. The short-nosed Mark I could be fitted with a pack of forward-firing guns beneath the fuselage, turning the bomber into an improvised interceptor. Night fighting was still a developing discipline. Crews had to find aircraft in darkness, move into a position to attack, and use equipment and procedures that were still changing as the war began. The Blenheim had not been designed from the beginning for that task, but it was available, fast enough to be useful, and large enough to carry the equipment then being introduced. L6739 served during this early period. Its exact operational record is incomplete, and surviving accounts disagree about the details of damage it suffered soon after reaching the squadron. What is clear is that its frontline life was brief. By the end of December 1940, it had been removed from service. Most retired military aircraft of that period were not treated as future historical objects. They were machines made from valuable metal, instruments, engines, wiring, and equipment that could be reused. Once an aircraft was no longer needed, dismantling was normal. L6739 largely disappeared through that process. Its nose did not. At Filton, Ralph Nelson, a Bristol employee and electrical engineer, removed the cockpit section from the disposal area. He was not saving a complete aircraft. He was taking one substantial piece of a machine that no longer had an official purpose. Nelson gave it another one. He mounted the Blenheim nose on the chassis of an Austin 7 and constructed an electrically powered road vehicle around it. The result was difficult to confuse with an ordinary car. The curved glazing, metal framing, and military cockpit shape remained visible. What had once led a twin-engined aircraft through the night now moved at road level, supported by a small automobile chassis. The conversion required changes. Parts of the lower structure had to be cut or altered. The interior could no longer remain arranged as a military cockpit. Steering, road controls, and the electric drive system had to occupy spaces designed for a pilot, navigator, instruments, and aircraft equipment. Nelson kept some of the pieces removed during the work. Decades later, those saved parts would help restorers reverse sections of the conversion. The vehicle was driven for years, then it suffered a fire. The cockpit had survived the scrapyard by becoming a car. Now the car itself had burned. Even then, the Blenheim nose was not destroyed completely. Its shape remained. Important original structure survived. Its identity could still be established from the manufacturer's plate attached to it. But there was no complete L6739 waiting to receive it. The rest of the wartime aircraft was gone. Anyone attempting to return a Blenheim to flight would have to find another foundation. That search led to Canada. During the war, Fairchild Aircraft of Canada had built the Bolingbroke, a close relative of the Bristol Blenheim. The Canadian aircraft shared the same design ancestry and much of the structure of the British type. After their military service, a number of Bolingbrokes survived in storage, on farms, or as incomplete airframes. They offered something Britain could no longer provide. They were not untouched Blenheims, but they contained the structure from which a flying Blenheim could be reconstructed. A long restoration effort produced the first Blenheim returned to flight in more than 40 years. Registered GMKIV, it flew in May 1987. Only weeks later, on the 21st of June, it was destroyed in an accident at Denham. No one was killed, but the aircraft was lost. The first project had proved that a Blenheim could be returned to the air. It had also shown how quickly years of work could disappear. The restorers began again. The second project used major components from another Canadian aircraft, Fairchild Bolingbroke 10201. It had been built in 1943 and had served with the Royal Canadian Air Force before being retired. Like many surplus aircraft, it spent years far from any prospect of flying again. Its components arrived at Duxford in 1988. The team could now use the experience gained from the first restoration. Major assemblies and systems were rebuilt before final installation. Structure that had deteriorated during storage had to be inspected, repaired, or replaced. The task was not to service an intact aircraft. It was to create a safe flying machine from an incomplete military airframe that had already spent decades out of use. The result was registered G-BPIV. In May 1993, it flew. At that stage, the aircraft had the longer nose associated with the later Blenheim and Bolingbroke family. It appeared at air shows and carried several historical paint schemes during the next decade. The short nose of L6739 was already moving toward the same destination. The surviving cockpit section reached the Duxford project in 1992. Work began on restoring it, but progress was slow. It had been cut for road use, altered internally, and damaged by fire. Restorers did not have a complete set of detailed drawings for everything that had to be rebuilt. They had original material, photographs, surviving components, and the physical evidence left in the structure itself. For years, the two projects remained close but separate. One was a complete flying aircraft with a Canadian airframe and a long nose. The other was an authentic British wartime nose without an aircraft. The event that joined them began on the 18th of August, 2003. G-BPIV had flown to Summerley Park for a display and was returning to Duxford. Before departure, the fuel quantity had been checked manually with a dipstick. During the flight home, the pilot noticed that the fuel gauges did not agree with each other. The total indicated quantity was also lower than expected. There was no obvious evidence of a leak. Because the fuel had been measured before the flight, the gauge readings appeared questionable. The pilot calculated that even if the indications were correct, the aircraft should still have enough fuel to complete the journey. But the calculation used consumption figures associated with a weaker mixture setting. The aircraft was being flown with the mixture set to normal. Reliable consumption figures for that exact condition were not available. The aircraft continued toward Duxford. As G-BPIV turned onto left base for runway 24, the right engine began to surge. The power was no longer steady. The aircraft was close to the airfield, but it was low and committed to the approach. On early final, the crew prepared to land in a field to the east of the runway. The flaps were lowered fully. Power was reduced for the forced landing. Then, the right engine began producing power again. For a moment, the runway appeared reachable. The pilot changed the plan and turned the aircraft back toward it. The right engine then stopped completely. Full power was applied to the left engine. The thrust was now coming from one side of the aircraft, producing a strong yaw and a developing roll. At low speed and close to the ground, there was little margin to control either. G-BPIV began rolling to the right. The pilot reduced power again to maintain control. The runway was now too far away. The aircraft struck an earth bank before the threshold, slid up it, turned through roughly 90 degrees, and came to rest. Both people aboard suffered minor injuries. The aircraft was badly damaged. The fuselage was distorted, and the landing gear had suffered severe damage. The Blenheim that had flown from Duxford for 10 years was no longer airworthy. The Air Accidents Investigation Branch report concluded that the right engine had stopped through fuel starvation. That finding did not mean every available quantity of fuel throughout the aircraft had been exhausted. Fuel remained associated with the other side of the system. Crossfeed had been selected, but the report found that it appeared unable to deliver fuel from the left tank to the right engine, while the aircraft was banked left on final approach. One question remained unanswered. Investigators could not establish why the right engine had consumed more fuel than the left. They did not identify a confirmed mechanical failure that explained the difference. The exact reason for the imbalance remained unresolved. The crash had ended G-BPIV's first flying life, but the damaged aircraft was recoverable. The owners and restorers now had to decide what they were trying to save. They could rebuild the long-nosed aircraft largely as it had been before the accident. Or they could use the opportunity to complete the short-nosed Blenheim that had existed for years only as a separate cockpit project. The nose of L6739 was already at Duxford. Work had begun before the crash, but without a complete aircraft to receive it, the project had remained limited. After the accident, the two objectives could become one. Blenheim Duxford Limited decided to rebuild G-BPIV as a short-nosed Mark IF, representing L6739, carrying the squadron code YPQ. This was not a simple exchange of detachable nose sections. The cockpit was part of the aircraft's structure. Controls, instruments, systems, glazing, framing, and adjoining fuselage sections all had to fit together. The L6739 nose had also spent part of its life attached to an Austin 7 chassis. Areas removed or modified for road use now had to function again as parts of a flying airframe. The team began with what had survived. Original structure was examined and retained where it remained suitable. The pieces Nelson had preserved helped reveal how some altered areas had once been formed. Historical photographs provided guidance where drawings were absent. New structural ribs were made to replace missing portions. The opening cockpit windows and their frames were restored. Controls and hydraulic components were reconstructed and connected to the Canadian airframe behind them. The work extended far beyond the nose. The impact in 2003 had damaged the fuselage, landing gear, engine installations, and surrounding structure. Major assemblies had to be repaired, rebuilt, tested, and fitted in the correct sequence. The project advanced through specialist work, fundraising, and volunteer labor. Progress was sometimes limited by money and by the cost of major engine and structural work. In places, the team was rebuilding an aircraft by studying surviving metal, wartime photographs, and the relationships between parts. The process lasted about 11 years. It required approximately 25,000 volunteer hours. During that time, the aircraft's identity changed physically. The long-nosed machine that had crashed in 2003 did not simply return in repaired form. It emerged as a different representation of the Blenheim family, now led by the surviving structure of L6739. On the 20th of November 2014, John Romaine took G-BPIV into the air. The flight was not the first time the Canadian airframe had flown. It had already spent a decade on the display circuit before the accident, but it was the first flight of the rebuilt, short-nosed Mark IF configuration. It was also the first time in decades that the nose of L6739 had traveled through the air. The part that had once been driven along a road was now leading an aircraft through the sky. G-BPIV continued to fly from Duxford, appearing at commemorative events and later taking part in film work. Like any operating historic aircraft, it required continuing inspection, maintenance, funding, and periods on the ground. Restoration did not end with the first successful flight. It became an ongoing responsibility. The aircraft is often described simply as Bristol Blenheim L6739, but its real identity is more complicated. The original L6739 did not survive as a complete machine. Bolingbroke 10201 was not built as L6739 and never served with No. 23 Squadron. The aircraft flying today combines their histories. The Canadian airframe made a flying reconstruction possible. Ralph Nelson's car project preserved the wartime nose, and the accident in 2003 created the opportunity to join them. Today, through the glazed cockpit, the crew sees the runway at Duxford. Behind them is an aircraft built largely in Canada, 4 years after L6739 entered service. Around them is a wartime nose that served with the Royal Air Force, was removed from a scrapyard, mounted on a car chassis, damaged by fire, reconstructed without complete drawings, and returned to flight. Most of L6739 disappeared more than 80 years ago. Its cockpit survived because, for a time, it stopped being an aircraft.